Here's the deal, Dave.
It's Greg.
Yeah, I know. I know it's Greg, Dave. But here's the thing. Ever since I put you in charge of social media, it just really hasn't been working out.
It's not my sweet spot, all right? I'm an accountant.
First of all, you don't have to sign your name after everything. What are you, my dad?
Well, again,
And then I have 6 tweets after that that just say google.com. Now, I can't even figure out, like, what was going through your brain when... Were you trying to Google from within Twitter? Please don't answer that. Long story short, my little brother is about to graduate from high school. He's got like 10,000 followers. I don't know how he does it. No one does. But we're gonna put him in charge of this, okay? So go ahead and send me an electronic mail with the usernames and passwords. Think you can handle that, Dave? Or do you need to write it down on your little pen and paper here?
I can handle that.
Okay, great. And then after that, we're gonna talk about your future here at this company. Thank you.
You want an email? I'll give you an email. Oh, that's good. I like that. Dear Hipster Doofus, here are your painfully obvious passwords. You bearded, no good, sneaker wearing. Oh, that's good. I haven't heard language like that since the Navy. Just because Daddy owns the company. Ooh, that's dark. But I like it.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah, Mike.
You know you've been tweeting?
I've been twittering!
Anybody ever had a job like that where you've wanted to do that to your boss? We're not going to admit that publicly. Okay, that's fine. I'm okay with that. Hey, I'm pretty glad that we're wrapping up this series, Me and My Big Mouth, because I don't know about you, but I've certainly felt very accountable to these words as we've been talking over the last couple of weeks. And to kind of give you a recap, if today's your first time, you've missed out on the last couple of weeks, here's a little recap. Right off the bat, right out of the gate, James, the brother of Jesus, who, again, it's just so cool that we have a document from the first century from James, the brother of Jesus. He's kind of given us our bottom line that we've been talking about throughout the series that we're going to look at today, hopefully one of the last times in a while, because again, I'm certainly feeling very accountable to this. But James said this. He said that we'd be quick to listen and that we're there to be slow to speak. They're quick to listen and slow to speak. And then he kind of dropped a bombshell on us, right? He said that our mouths are untamable, that we cannot control our mouths, that we always have to stand guard of our mouths because we need to know what our mouths are going to say. They have the potential, they're a threat to every single person that we value and the things that we value the most. And so we've been talking about this the whole time, so I'd love for us to repeat it after me, maybe for the last time. Repeat it after me. Quick to listen and slow to speak. One last time with a little bit of fervor and the hand actions this time. Let's go. Ready? Quick to listen and slow to speak. And then he kind of goes a little bit further, and he kind of steps into another level for each and every one of us. And he kind of gives us some building words, which I kind of felt were really useful. But he says to us, hey, and I think if you're a Christian here today, I think we're accountable to these things. If you're not a Christian today, this is just good advice, right? Because you want people to treat you like that as well. You want people to be quick to listen to you and slow to speak back to you. But if you're a Christian, you're accountable to these words. And we believe, certainly as Christians, that every single person is made in the image of God. And James comes along and says, no, we don't want you to have any distasteful, any unwholesome words coming out of my mouth. In fact, I challenge you to go and memorize that, right? Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. But he says, hey, we don't want any of that to come out of your mouths. And he says, no, we don't want any disrespectful, any degrading, any demeaning words coming out of our mouths. And if we believe that everyone's made in the image of God, how dare we go and talk to someone who God views as precious in a distasteful way? We even said this. We said, hey, we need to avoid fish mouth, right? We need to not talk about those things that give us distaste in our mouths. We need to avoid fish mouth. If you even follow me on Twitter, like that's just a great, great hashtag, by the way. I'm trying to get it to become a thing. I told you last week, it must become a thing for us. So, hey, don't talk about your fish mouth. But James kind of gives us these great, great building blocks for each and every one of us. And he says this: conversations are construction sites, and that words are building material, and that every time we have a conversation with someone, we need to actually build someone up. And then Paul kind of goes to the deepest of this. He kind of goes right to the root of everything that's going on around here. We looked at last week. he kind of gets right up in our face and starts talking to us about, what's really going on. And he says that you need to get rid of your bitterness. You need to get rid of your bitterness. And maybe you might, be here today, and it's not necessarily about what's going on around you right now that's making you bitter. It's about the things that have happened to you in the past, right? It's about those words that have been said over you. It's the words that were spoken about you. It's the words that were spoken to you. And you keep dwelling on those things, and it's making you bitter. And Paul says, no, you need to get rid of your bitterness because it's difficult to be a builder if you are bitter. And I don't know if this is true for you, and I certainly think that it's true for me, but the way we get rid of our bitterness is, as we looked at last week, is through forgiveness, right? And forgiveness is simply saying to someone from the past that you don't owe me anything anymore. It's saying, hey, I'm not gonna treat you. I'm not gonna let you pay me back for something that you should be paying me back for. I'm gonna write that debt clean, so I can give the people around me right now what they actually deserve. And maybe for you, there's this brand from the past that makes us want to, that brands us so badly that it in fact makes us want to hurt the people around us and the people we maybe value the most. It comes through in our actions, it comes through in our words, certainly. But Paul says that if we do the work to get rid of our bitterness, if we get rid of our anger, one of the great things is we are going to be positioned to be the heroes in our own stories. And it's not as simple as just forgiving everyone. It's not as simple as just loving everyone around us. You and I have the opportunity to be the hero in our story because of what we're going to talk about today. Because every once in a while, and this might not be the case for you, and I'm going to say this, and you're going to be like, there's no way this is ever going to happen for me. But every once in a while, what goes around comes around. What goes around often comes around. The powerless find themselves in a position of power. The people who hurt you may at some point in the future need you. And how you leverage your words when the people who hurt you need you says more about you than I think anything else on this earth. And I want you to be ready. And I certainly want to be ready for when that day comes around. And so today, I want to talk about maybe the second greatest story that's ever been told. If the greatest story ever told was about this God who came to rescue this rebellious nation, this rebellious race of ours, and he sent his son to pay a debt that we could never pay, then a story that mirrors that, I think, that happens way back before Jesus even came on this planet, I believe that that is the second greatest story ever told. And so if you start in the book of Genesis and you want to read the Bible, it's going to take you a long, long time before you find Jesus, right? But it's not too long before you bump into this man named Abraham. And that's where our story begins. God says to Abraham, hey, I'm going to make you into a great family. I'm going to make you into a great nation. In fact, I'm going to bless the entire world through you. And if you know the story, Abraham and Sarah, they have a little bit of trouble, and it takes them quite a while before they have a child. They have a child named Isaac, and Isaac has two sons. One of them is named Jacob. And looking at that, it's not much of a family, right? It's not much of a nation. It's kind of something that doesn't really look like it's going anywhere. In fact, if you should just go read the text, the amount of stuff that goes on in that family just for those 3 generations is like insane. But Jacob comes along, and he ends up having 12 sons. That looked a lot different when I did that earlier. Anyway, so you got 12 sons. Jacob has these 12 sons, and one of those, he has these 12 sons, and suddenly 3 or 4 generations later, it begins to look a bit more like a nation, especially considering first century standards. And what's amazing to me is that this promise that God gave to Abraham is so amazing. It ends up hanging on the thread of one person's words. This whole plan for redemption for the entire world is hanging on one person's words. And as we're going to find out, it hangs on one of his sons, and his son's name is in fact Joseph. Now, Joseph was Jacob's favorite son because he was born from Jacob's favorite wife. Jacob had 2 wives, and he had a whole bunch of concubines that he had children with as well. And there's a takeaway for us in there. Men don't have a favorite wife, okay? It caused a lot of problems for Jacob, and it will cause you a lot of problems as well. And so Jacob has these favorite wives, and Rachel gives birth to Joseph, and then ends up giving birth to a second son named Benjamin. And unfortunately, during childbirth, she dies. And so Jacob's left mourning the loss of his favorite wife for years and years and years. And inevitably, Joseph becomes his favorite son. And Benjamin's a little too young to kind of, form part of this narrative, but He has 10 mostly older brothers, and we find out that they resent him. They realize that Joseph is loved by Jacob way more than any of them, and they resent him for it. And so one day Jacob says to Joseph, hey, why don't you go out into the field and go check up on your brothers, which Joseph hated. I mean, he hated going out there to check on these brothers, and the brothers hated this even more. And they see him coming over the hill, and they're like, this is ridiculous. I want to put an end to this right now. Hey, guys, let's kill him. And so he walks over. They strip him of his robe, this special robe that his father had made for him. And if you grew up Jewish, or maybe you have grown up in church over the years, you know the story quite well. They throw him in a pit, and a pit didn't have any water in it, but it's not a great place to be. And before they decide to kill him, they sit down and they have lunch, right? And the text says this, and they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, to which Joseph's at the bottom of the pit going, hey guys, I'd also like some food. You know, maybe you can share something with me. But they see this caravan coming along, and the text says this, that Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? A little bit of compassion coming in there, right? And he says, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, and there's this flood of compassion to each and every one of them. He is our brother, all our own flesh and blood, and immediately the compassion's gone. So they pull him out of the pit, they tie his hands up. You can imagine, if we pause for long enough and you think about this, I mean, this 17-year-old boy being pulled out of the pit knowing that his brothers are going to kill him, hearing the conversation that's going on there, and he comes out of this pit, and in front of him are a group of people that they're talking all kinds of languages. He has no idea what is going on, and his brothers tie up his hands, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites that are coming through. And you can imagine the terror that is going through this 17-year-old as he stands there, and he waves goodbye to his brothers. His brothers are standing there thinking, we're never going to see this kid ever again. And Joseph's thinking, I am never going to see home again. Now the text continues and says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And then the author tells us something which I find really strange, but it's kind of a theme that goes throughout the story. The author says this, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. Now, you and I might think, well, no, if the Lord was with Joseph, he wouldn't be in the situation, right? He would be at home with Jacob, with his family, right? The boys, the rest of these boys, their brothers, they're getting away with something that they shouldn't be getting away with. But what's amazing to me, and perhaps the takeaway for you and for me throughout this story, is that not only was God with Joseph the entire time, but Joseph chose to live as if God was with him. Even though he might have felt abandoned throughout this entire story, he chose to live as if God was with him. So if you remember the story, Joseph carries on. He gains a little bit of favor with Potiphar along the way. He ends up getting more responsibility. Eventually, he ends up managing the entire household of Potiphar. And Potiphar's not the only person who's noticed what Joseph is able to do. Potiphar's wife starts noticing him as well. And this isn't language that we find in the text, but maybe this was the language that they would have used. Potiphar's wife comes to Joseph one day and says, I require your presence, slave. I require you to sleep with me. And this isn't an ask, this is a commandment. And perhaps for the very first time in her entire life, she got no for an answer. Suddenly the slave, this Hebrew slave that comes from a foreign land, is telling the wife of his master no. And the amazing thing that the response that he gives to Potiphar is he says, look, your husband has given me dominion over everything that he owns except for you. So how dare I do something like that? And then Joseph says this, he says to her, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? To which again, you might be sitting here thinking, God? What has God done for you lately? God got you sold as a slave to a whole bunch of people you had no idea where you were going. And you're still supporting this God in that? I mean, Potiphar's wife must have been irate at this point, right? I mean, no one had ever said no to her, especially not a slave. I mean, how dare a slave say no to her in that moment? I mean, she probably didn't know what sinning against God was. Who knows? I certainly don't know the answer to that question. But this goes on day after day after day after day. And eventually, he just keeps saying, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. And she eventually, gives into the guilt. She gives into the shame. She's just had enough. And she accuses Joseph of raping her. And Potiphar, when he finds out, he's got no choice, right? Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And then here's this theme again. But while Joseph was in the prison, the Lord was with him. To which we say, no. Don't good things happen to good people? Don't bad things happen to bad people? Like if God was with Joseph, he wouldn't be the one in prison, right? Potiphar's wife would be the one in prison. Then it says, but God, he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Again, if God was with you, you don't have a personal relationship with the prison warden, right? You're not in that position. Something else should be happening there. And I think through this, we are reminded about something that each and every one of us need to be reminded about every now and then. That bad things have been happening to good people for a very long time. Bad things have been happening to good people for a very long time. But the byproduct of that is also true. That God has been with good people in bad times for a long time as well. So the story goes, Joseph eventually becomes the administrative assistant to the prison warden. He's basically running the entire prison. We find out later in the story he hates being there. It's certainly not a nice place. He has a little bit of favor along the way, but he hates being in this prison. In fact, the description of the prison is a bit more like a dungeon, right? If you've ever been to a London dungeon or you've seen a dungeon, it's kind of all underground. Who knows when he would have seen the light of day or if he had ever been allowed out to see the light of day. And a little bit later on, Pharaoh, the problem with the story is that, it happens over just a few chapters, but it's years and years of stuff that is going on. A few years later, Pharaoh's baker and his butler have a falling out with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh puts these two into prison. And one day, Joseph wakes up and he can see that these two guys are down. And I'm like, I find this funny. I mean, of course you're down. You're in prison, right? You're down every day that you're in prison. But Joseph notices that they're a little bit down, and he's like, hey, guys, what's going on? Is there anything I can help you with? And they say, we're just both so troubled. We had these dreams last night, and we're convinced that they mean something, but we just can't figure out what is going on. And Joseph's like, hey, I've had a little bit of favor before with being able to interpret dreams. And so, hey, if you tell me your dreams, maybe I could help you out. Maybe I could do something for you. So the butler goes first, and the butler tells him his dream in the prison. And Joseph sits there and he thinks for a little bit, and he's like, okay, I've got some good news for you. In 3 days' time, it's Pharaoh's birthday. And on Pharaoh's birthday, he's going to lift up your head. And he's going to restore you as his butler and as the main wine taster. And this guy's like, oh, man, that's great. But then Joseph says something, and it's so raw. You should really go and read the text. These are my words, not his. But he's like, won't you remember me? When you get out, won't you remember me? I've been taken from my land. I've been kidnapped. I'm here. I do not deserve to be here in any way. But when you get out there, I just want someone to know on the outside that I'm, in fact, in here. Would you remember me? I mean, the butler's just got some great news. He's like, sure, I'm going to remember you. Of course I'm going to remember you. So the moment I get out, I'm going to tell everyone about you and how you helped me out with these dreams. The baker's sitting in the corner, and he's like, man, that's great. I wonder what my dream means, right? And the baker says to Joseph, hey, here's my dream, and he explains the whole thing to Joseph. Joseph sits there, and he says, okay, your head's going to be lifted up as well. Off your body, unfortunately, you're going to be impaled, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. Now, if I was there, and I think if you were there as well, I don't know how you would have responded. I wouldn't have given so much detail, right? I would have been like, I don't actually know. Like, just give me a couple more days. Like, I just want to think about it a little bit, Think about it. I certainly would have given him that much detail in his response to what the dream means. But sure enough, 3 days later, the baker is beheaded and he's impaled, and the butler is risen back up and he goes out. And now I just want you to pause and imagine this, because and it's difficult for us to imagine. But there's Joseph sitting in prison. He's just done this great thing for this butler, and he's been restored, right? He's back in Pharaoh's kingdom, and he said he was going to tell everyone. Imagine him sitting there, right, like, now's my chance. One day goes past, and he's like, oh, so today's the day. They're going to come fetch me. So he's told someone, and they're going to come fetch me. 2 days go past. He's like, oh, he's forgotten. It's taking a little bit of time. It's an administrative process. Maybe it's going to happen tomorrow, right? And then the third day comes, and a week goes by, and a month goes by, and still no one. Imagine the disappointment that Joseph experiences. And the text tells us that the butler forgot about Joseph. And maybe that's your situation. You might be sitting here today and you feel like you've been forgotten. And a year goes past, and 2 years go past, and 3 years go past, and Joseph is sitting there and still in prison, and he feels like this is going to be his lot for life. But he continues to believe that God is in fact with him. Now Joseph is 30 years old, And Pharaoh has a series of dreams, and they're so vivid and so disturbing to Pharaoh that he's like, I've got to have these interpreted. And so he calls all his magicians, all of his counselors into the court, and he tells them these dreams, hoping that one of them is going to be able to interpret this dream somehow that he's had. And suddenly, none of them can do this. And suddenly the butler remembers, hey, remember that guy? And the butler, these are my words, not the butler's words in this conversation, but the butler's like, hey, Pharaoh, I'm sorry to disturb you. You remember a couple of years ago we had this tiff and you threw me in prison? It really wasn't a big deal. I promise it wasn't a big deal. I'm sorry I'm even bringing it up. But I was in prison because of you, and I met this Hebrew slave, and I told him one of my dreams, and he was able to interpret my dream. And the very thing he said actually came true. And in fact, if he's still there, if he's alive, I mean, it's been years. I have no idea if he's still even there. But if he is, hey, maybe we should go fetch him, and maybe he could interpret your dream. And so the text says this. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought up from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, because he smelled like prison, he'd been there for however many years, he came before Pharaoh. Now, I want you to imagine the contrast here, right? He's been underground, maybe. He hasn't seen the light of day, and suddenly he's whisked off, right? Just one day they come out and lock, pull him out. He's put into a chair. He's shaved. They start pampering him, perfuming him. They're getting him dressed all nicely, and he's like, hey, what's going on? No, Pharaoh wants to see you. Pharaoh wants to see me? Why would Pharaoh want to see me? Shush, you need to pay attention. This is how you address him. This is how you bow down to him. This is how close you can get to him. These are the things you're supposed to say to him. Pharaoh wants you in his presence right now. And so Pharaoh says to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And what comes next, I think, is perhaps one of the most courageous statements ever spoken by someone in all of history. This foreigner, whose God has done absolutely nothing for him in the last little while, stands up and says to the most powerful person on the planet, he says this, I cannot do it. Joseph, you had such a great chance. You just got to interpret the dream and then you can go. Then you're going to be free. And he says, I cannot do it. And the butler's sitting there going, hi ho, it's off to prison I go. Why did I even bring this up? But Joseph carries on and says, I cannot do it, but God, which you never say to Pharaoh. I mean, Pharaoh thinks he's a God, right? Pharaoh believes, he wakes up every day believing he's a God. He says, but God can. God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And Joseph says, hey, Pharaoh, just want to remind you, you're a little g God, but big G God, my big G God, can answer your request. And again, if you grew up listening to the story, you know what happens next. Pharaoh goes and tells him his dream and his dreams, and Joseph sort of sits back, waits a little bit, and then gives the interpretation. He says, okay, well, the reason you've had all these dreams is because they all mean the same thing. God, big God, is trying to tell you what is going to happen over the next couple of years in Egypt. And he interprets the dream, and he says, well, for 7 years, there's just going to be an abundance of grain. It's going to be the best years in Egypt, and people are going to be swimming in grain. People are going to be coming from all over the country to come and buy grain from Egypt. It's going to be 7 years of abundance. But after those 7 years of abundance are finished, the rain's going to stop. The locusts are going to come, and there's going to be a famine. In fact, the famine's going to come so quickly that these people are going to forget very quickly about the years of abundance that we've had. And honestly, between you and me, if you're talking to Pharaoh, Joseph should have stopped there, right? He had the opportunity. He's given the interpretation of the dream. Hey, Joseph, you're free. Walk away. You've done what was required of you. But then he does the unthinkable. He goes and he tells Pharaoh what he should do. He goes and tells the most powerful man in the world what he should do. And I kind of cringe and go, you shouldn't have done that. But Joseph carries on. He goes in and he says, right, Pharaoh, this is what you should do. And I think that in the whole courtroom, there were kind of like gasps, like, you don't talk to Pharaoh like this. And Joseph says to him, well, in the next 7 years, you need to find cities, and you need to declare them as grain cities. You need to build massive silos, and you need to tax everyone around 20% of their grain. There's going to be so much, they're not even going to care. But you want to tax 20%. I think that's why Pharaoh was sitting there going, okay, carry on talking. I'll listen to this. Do it in your name. Tax these people in your name. Get them to bring 20% of the grain into these silos, and you're going to store all of these up. So by the end of the years of abundance, you are going to have 20% of all the grain in this entire country. And so he says, once that's happened, once the years of abundance are finished and the rain stop and it becomes a little difficult for people, then I want you to open those doors. But I don't want you to just give the grain away. I want you to sell the grain. I want you to sell the grain to these people, and you can then take control of everything that is going on. By the way, you're going to need someone in this space who's going to have their eye on this the whole time, because you cannot take your eye off the ball. If we take our eye off the ball here, this is all going to fall flat. You've got to have someone in there who is working on this 24/7. And there is silence. There's one or two gasps as he's telling Pharaoh what to do. And the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all of his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, and there's a little bit of, I want you to tell me this in this comment. Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And when Pharaoh, the most powerful man on the planet, tells you what his answer should be, you give him that answer, right? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all of this known to you, there is no one so discerning and as wise as you. You, Joseph, shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. And I'm pretty sure that the guys who were sitting there, who were second, third, and fourth in line, I went, we've known this guy for like 45 minutes. He still smells like the prison. Why are you putting him in charge? But you can't say that to Pharaoh. You can't say that to the most powerful man in the world. And he makes Joseph, straight out of prison, he makes Joseph into the prime minister of Egypt. And he gets to work. We know he's efficient, right? He trained in Potiphar's household. He didn't know he was training. He trained in the prison. He had no idea he was training there. So he goes ahead and he's starting to save a nation. And he's building all these grain silos. He appoints the cities, building these massive silos going on. He starts taxing all these people and getting in 20% of the grain. And the famine comes in. And at the right time, he opens these doors and he starts selling grain to these people. And I mean, it gets so desperate. People have just as he predicted, people have forgotten about the years of abundance very, very quickly. People are selling everything they have, their cattle, everything, just to try and buy grain. And the text tells us the famine reached so far north that it got into the area where Joseph's family were actually living, that all the way north to where Joseph's family lived. And when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? Which is funny. He's like, come on, we're starving here, right? He continued and said, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die. I'm like, guys, do I even have to ask? I mean, there's grain down there. We don't have any grain. Come on, go down there and buy some grain. And I think that the stage is set right here because the fortunes have been reversed. Now, Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. It just so happens that Joseph's brothers arrive in the same town that Joseph happens to be in on that day. And when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. So they got in there, and they didn't recognize him. And do you know why they didn't recognize him? Because he walked like an Egyptian. You've got to remember, the last time that they saw Joseph, he was 17 years old, a scrawny little teenager. And they pulled him out of a well, they pulled him out of a pit, tied his hands together, and waved him goodbye. And they thought, I'm never going to see this guy ever again. And I want to ask you a question, which I think we all have to wrestle with. And maybe this isn't something that you can comprehend right now because of the situation you're in. But what do you do? What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? And I think your response to that depends on how and what you did with your bitterness and your anger. And if you've been dragging it along behind you the whole time, you're going to become like the people that you don't like. You can imagine Joseph standing there, and these brothers walk in, and they don't recognize him. But in his mind, he remembers everything that's happened to him. He remembers how they stripped him of his robe, how they threw him in a pit and were talking about killing him, how they pulled him out, how they tied his hands, and they watched as he was taken away by the Ishmaelites. He remembers how he was in Potiphar's household and finally beginning to feel like he has some form of life, and he's accused falsely of rape and gets thrown into prison. And then he's pulled out into this, years of interpreting dreams, and no one's ever coming through for him. And the men that are responsible for those very things are sitting right in front of him. And you really should read the text, because for the next about 3 chapters, all he does is he plays with these guys. He accuses them of being spies. He even keeps Benjamin behind and makes it look as though Benjamin has stolen something of value. And I think he's trying to figure out, hey, are these guys still the same guys who sold me when I was 17? Have these guys changed in any way? I think he was probably wrestling with this very question. What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? So Joseph, the text carries on. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So this goes on for a couple of months, remember, and this is all condensed in, and eventually they're all back in Egypt. And they happen to be sitting there after he's been teasing them and checking them out for about 3 months. And he gets them into a room, and he cannot control himself. He says, "Everyone go out." And now his brothers, unbeknown to them, are standing in front of the most powerful man in the world. They're standing in front of his brother, who happens to be the second most powerful man in the world at this time. And he's like, why is this guy singling us out? Why is he choosing us? And now we're alone in the room with this man. And the text tells us, so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. I mean, imagine this. He's been waiting 3 months, maybe at least 3 chapters, to be able to say this to his brothers. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." And they wetteth themselves. That's not in the text. But can you imagine the fear that went through them when he revealed himself? Because they expected him to do to them exactly what they had done to him. I mean, with one word, he could have had 10 stakes set up out there in the courtyard, and they would have been impaled. And back then, how impaled were they? They didn't impale all of them at the same time. They would have had the 9 sit in the corner with their hands tied behind their back, watching as one of them got impaled. And not to get too gruesome on you, you only died when the stake went through your heart. This could have taken hours. And when the one's done, they bring the next one. This could have taken days. That's what awaited them had it not been their brother. And Joseph can't contain himself. He says this, "Is my father still living? I don't know what's going on back home. Won't you tell me?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Because they were recounting what had happened to him, what they had done to him. But they need not be terrified in his presence, because the whole time that Joseph had lived through all of these things, he believed that God was with him, that God might have seemed absent to everyone else around him, but he kept his bitterness at bay. And what Joseph could not have known in these moments was that God's plan for redemption of the whole world, that God's whole plan of what he'd spoken to Abraham hung in the balance of his very words. That God's plan for redemption of sending his son to do for you and me what we could never do, to pay a debt that we would never be able to pay, was ultimately what Joseph decided to do in that moment. And it mirrors the story that God would have in the situation, that God would ultimately forgive you and me. And Joseph chose to forgive his brothers as well. Joseph could have said one word, stakes outside, and 10 of the 12 tribes through which God would send a Savior into this world would have been gone. The entire plan hung on Joseph's words. Is my father still living? He wants to know. So he says to his brothers, he has them stand up and he embraces them. He says, hey, I want you to go back. I want you to go fetch your families. I want you to go fetch your kids. I've been missing out on all of this. I want you to bring all of them back to Egypt, and I'm going to take care of you. And he does. And the text carries on. So his brothers, okay, let me go before this. He sends them all back, and they come back, and they live in Egypt, and he takes care of them. And a couple of years later, they've been there for a few years, and his father dies. Jacob eventually dies. And you can imagine, the 10 brothers get together, and they're like, uh-oh, Dad's dead. We've been Joseph's hostages this entire time, and now that Daddy's dead, he's going to take his vengeance on us. And so his brothers came to him, go back one, his brothers came to him and said, and threw themselves down before him. And we are your slaves, they said. They're like, hey, we realize what you did to us. We sold you as a slave, but hey, if you'll just spare our families, if you spare our lives, if you'll spare what is going on right now, we'll be your slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. And then there's a question that we're all going to have to wrestle with at some point. Am I in the place of God? Not am I God, because I know I'm not God, but am I in place of God? And I want you to listen to this. You will never experience the good that comes from the bad unless you recognize that God was with you during those bad times and you refuse to play God when things are good. You will never experience the good that can come from bad unless you recognize that God was with you during the bad and you refuse to play God. You refuse to take control. You refuse to play God when things are good. Joseph says this, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. He says, so then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke to them kindly. One day, and I don't know when that one day is going to be, but one day you may have the power over the person or the persons who took something from you. You're going to have the power of those people who hurt you. You're going to have the power over the people who stole that first marriage from you. You're going to have the power over someone who stole your childhood. You're going to have the power over someone who stole the very thing that you've wanted to be able to accomplish your entire life. You are going to have the power over the people who've hurt you, who've harmed you, who've done all kinds of things for you. And you have a choice in that. And I hope that you would remember all those things that they took from you. Not to, drive it in you, but I hope that you're probably going to remember those things. What they did to you, what they said to you. But God's going to invite you to say, who was with you? Who was with you the entire time? Who was with you through the bad? Who was with you through all of those moments? And you'll have a decision to make, just like Joseph, I think, had the decision. What will you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? What will you do when you have the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemies? Will you pay them back? Or will you use your words to pave the way forward? And I think your decision is determined by your perspective, the perspective you have between now and then. And I certainly pray that you're going to take your cue from the one who gave his life for you, not the one who took life from you or the people who took life from you. I hope that you're going to look at that situation, whatever it is, and that you would take your cue from the one, from those who have been with you the entire time, that one who's been with you the entire time, and not from the people who have abandoned you, the people who have walked away from you. And if you're able to do that, you'll be like your Father in heaven, and you will in fact be free. Now I realize that this is kind of heavy, and I certainly want maybe some of you're writing this down because you don't need this right now, but I want you to be ready. I want you to know what you're going to do when you're faced with this question. When you have the power of the people and your words determine the destiny of your enemy, I want you to be ready. So I want to give us all a moment to just process this, because I think this is something we all need to be ready for. And we're going to sing a song, and maybe you haven't heard this song before. I think there's some words in the song that are very powerful. And maybe you have heard this song, but I'd love to invite us to just think about this, to process this as we go through this. The chorus says this, through it all. And for you, it may be a capital A-L-L, because you're going through so much right now that it is all-consuming. The chorus says, through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. And the bridge says this, that let go my soul and trust in him. The waves and wind still know his name. And he knows your name. In fact, he's with you wherever you go. And that is the reason we're able to say that it is well with my soul. Let me pray for us. Father God, it's so much easier to be able to stand up here and talk about this than actually do it. But Father, as the Apostle Paul says, it's about what we do with what we know, not just knowing certain things. That we have to apply these things. We cannot just listen to these things. Father, I pray that we would have the courage to be able to step into this, that we're faced with the situation of we're going to pay them back or we're going to pave the way forward. And then, Father, I pray for the men, the women, the students that are here, that we would just catch a glimpse of the fact that you're with us, you're with us, you're with us, wherever we may go. And Father, when we're faced with that question, when we're faced with that desire to want to pay someone back, Father, would you give us the courage to forgive them, even if it means forgiving them over and over and over and over and over again. Father God, I certainly want to thank you for your Son, Jesus, that you sent him into the world to do for every single one of us what ultimately Joseph did for his brothers, was forgive us. Father, I'm so grateful for your Son. And it's in his precious name we pray. Amen.
Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me. Far be from me to not believe, and even when my eyes can't see, and this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well. It is well. So let go, my soul, and trust in him. The waves and wind shall know his name. So let go, my soul, and trust in him. The waves and wind shall know his name. So let go, my soul, and trust in him. The waves and wind shall know his name. The waves and wind shall know his name. Won't you stand and sing with us? It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. it is well. Oh, through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me. Thanks so much for joining us today. We will be serving tea and coffee in the foyer, and we'll see you for next week.